Sometimes motorcycle manufacturers create their greatest machines out of sheer necessity, whether their backs are against the wall in need of something fresh and new, or as with the tiny, high-revving Japanese supersports of the 90s, a need to make a new kind of motorcycle altogether. In the late 1980s, everyone wanted a sport bike, but for young Japanese riders, the law actually kept them from riding anything with a capacity over 250 cc's. This meant that if they wanted to get a bike that would give them that high-revving supersport experience, well, they'd just have to wait for it. For the Japanese manufacturers tasked with making compelling motorcycles to the younger generation of potential sport bike riders, it was time for something new. Now, I've been wanting to have some sponsors for the channel that are essentially American companies making American goods right here in America. So I got a hold of this amazing company, which is based in Chicago, called Oak Street Bootmakers, and they hooked me up with their incredible field boot in black Chrome XL leather. If you guys know anything about quality, handmade, Goodyear welted boots, there's a good chance that you've heard of Oak Street and, of course, heard of Horween's famous Chrome XL leather. Now, this company makes fantastic products with all the materials sourced here in the US, and then they're also made here as well. Plus, Oak Street functions more like a local business. If you need help with sizing, which is really important when you're getting these kinds of boots, you can just reach out to them by email or phone, and they'll help you get the size for you. For example, I'm a 10.5 length on the Brannock device, but this is a really roomy boot, especially in the toe area, and I don't have wide feet, so I actually went down to a 10, and it fits absolutely perfect. Now, the great thing about quality Goodyear welted boots that are made from full grain leather is that even though they are a bit more expensive, you're getting a boot that can be resold, unlike cheaper boots, and like a quality motorcycle, these kinds of boots just get better over time. Even in the few days that I've worn them, they've softened up, they've broken quite a bit, and that will just keep happening, especially with Chrome XL leather. Every year that goes by, it just keeps getting better and better as you own them, and these are the kind of boots that you can potentially own for a lifetime. You just service them by resoling them every however many years, depends on how much you wear them. Now, I've owned nice boots before. These are in another league entirely. They're just fantastic, and I cannot recommend them enough. Now, we're not promoting these specifically as motorcycle safety boots, but if you are going to wear these riding, which a lot of people just wear nice leather boots riding, any quality leather boot is better than regular shoes. The field boot is probably the best to get because it has the Vibram sole option. Now, I've put a link in the description to their site to make it easy for you guys. Plus, we've set up a deal where if you use code BART, you can get 20% off site-wide, besides items that are already on sale or recrafting services. So check them out, click the link in the description, and big thanks to Oak Street for sponsoring this video. Now, I'm guessing that at this point, you've probably heard of Honda's 250cc sport bike from the 90s that revved pretty much to 20,000 RPM. But there's not just Honda. All the Japanese manufacturers were making these kinds of motorcycles. But what's the reason? Why were they all racing to build these miniature replicas of really full-blown four-stroke race bikes? We mentioned laws prohibiting young riders from getting anything over 250 cc's, which is obviously a huge factor, but it's more than that. Even if you were able to purchase a bigger motorcycle, you now faced a test every 2 years where the bike would be gone over extensively to check for anything even slightly wrong. This meant any modifications were really frowned on, and the whole testing process was just expensive, and this is still true for certain motorcycles in Japan. All in all, for Japanese riders, owning these bigger sport bikes, it kind of amounted to one big headache. But still, everybody in Japan who wanted to ride wanted a real sport bike. Not a bike that simply looked like one, but a real one. And thanks to the popularity of racing in Japan, think races like the Suzuka 8-hour event, which drew in over 100,000 spectators consistently at its peak, which is really at this point in the 80s and 90s. Riders really understood what a race bike was. They couldn't be fooled with just a bike that looked the part. So the Japanese manufacturers knew what the path was forward. It was to build 250cc motorcycles that had everything a sport bike rider could ever want and more. So they started to build them. Though companies like Suzuki had 250cc two-stroke street bikes that were arguably faster for most riders, than any of the high-revving 4-stroke 250s, they knew that these bikes needed to be high-revving inline 4 4-strokes because they needed to emulate the 4-stroke leader bikes that were sort of at the top of all of their lineups, because these were the bikes that everyone craved. In light of Honda and Yamaha's utter dominance in racing at this time, especially in that Suzuka 8-hour race, they were the first two companies to really release motorcycles of this formula, that is high-revving 250cc inline 4 4-strokes. Those small inline 4s date back to bikes like the CB354 and the Benelli 254. For this era, it really all started with Yamaha's 250cc Phaser in 1984. This was a double overhead cam, 16-valve, inline 4 redlining at about 16,000 RPM and making 45 horsepower at 14.5. Things would really heat up in 1986 in the form of the Honda CBR 254 or MC14. Then later, the Yamaha FZR 250, and then also Suzuki would join the mix just a year later in 1987 with the GSXR 250, which is a really, really rare bike, and not very many of them were made. And though Kawasaki had the GPZ 250R, that was actually a twin, and it did rev really high for a twin, but it was really no match for these new inline 4s. Kawasaki wouldn't really join the mix until 1989 with their ZXR 250R, and we'll talk more about that bike later. Now, all of these motorcycles really revved. All of them were tiny race bikes, and it's sad that bikes like the Yamaha FZR 250 have been somewhat overlooked by the popularity of the CBR 250RR. I mean, all of these bikes were just incredible bikes, and it's worth looking into all of them. But in retrospect, there is a reason the little Honda became such a legend, and that's because it was the best. Of all the Japanese manufacturers trying to make these kinds of motorcycles, no one else had the history and the experience of Honda. Not only making 4-stroke race bikes, but specifically tiny 4-stroke race bikes. Through the 60s, Honda fought head-on against the 2-stroke onslaught in Grand Prix racing in every class, but primarily in the smaller classes ranging from 50 to 350 cc's. At one point, they made a 50cc motorcycle that revved to like 22,000 RPM. Now, this decade-long battle really forced Honda to discover the full potential of 4-stroke technology, not just in terms of performance, but also just reliability. You know, your 4-stroke lawnmower or car, regardless of who makes it, it probably owes something to Honda's work in the 60s on these 4-stroke race bikes. Because more innovation happened in the 60s from Honda working on race bikes for 4-stroke technology than really any other era in motorcycle history and in car history. Now, everything Honda learned in their dominance of Grand Prix racing impacted their success in the development of 4-stroke production machines, whether 2 or 4-wheeled, even if specific features weren't always directly applied to their models. But a few motorcycles through history from Honda in terms of production have come straight from their racing development. Bikes like the hulking 6-cylinder CBX, which was headed up by the same guy who led the development of Honda's ridiculous 6-cylinder Grand Prix bikes of the 60s. His name was Soichiro Irimajiri. Now, it's actually pretty difficult finding really good, detailed information about some of these motorcycles. We do know that Soichiro Irimajiri was still at Honda through 1992, so he could have potentially been involved with the CBR 250R and CBR 250RR. We don't know, but we do know that this bike really emulated those tiny high-revving race machines that Soichiro Irimajiri was so involved with. And this bike specifically, the Honda CBR 250R and RR, this was like a tiny Grand Prix race machine. Now, I think the fact that Yamaha, with their Phaser 250 in 1984, I think the fact that they were the first to make a motorcycle like this, which was literally Honda's bread and butter, it sort of hit their ego in a way. How dare Yamaha make a motorcycle like this? Honda knew that if anybody was going to lead in a new segment of tiny, small, high-revving 4-stroke production race bikes, it had to be them. But when Honda got a hold of the bike that started this movement, that is the Yamaha Phaser 250, they were shocked by its simplicity. Was this double overhead inline 4 really utilizing chain-driven cams? Sure, it revved to 16,000 RPM rather effortlessly, but Honda knew that they could do it better. So they went to work tirelessly building their own new little platform, and by 1986 they had a complete bike, the MC14 or CBR 254. It weighed the same as the Phaser, made the same power, probably due to limits on 250cc bikes, but now it didn't redline at 16,000 RPM, No, that's child's play. The CBR 250 redlined at 17,000 RPM. Yeah, screw you, Yamaha. This was thanks to Honda's use of gear-driven cams. Gear-driven cams versus those utilizing chains and sprockets really enables more accurate valve timing and less friction, and thus more spinning. For most applications, chain-driven cams are totally fine, because most engines aren't hitting anywhere near 17,000 RPM, but this isn't most applications. This called for race technology. The little screaming 250 would live its entire life and perform its best and be dialed in the most above 13,000 RPM. So this called for minute tolerances. If Honda was going to win the tiny superbike battle by once again adding more revs, they needed to utilize this gear-driven setup. Though it is often heavier and especially more expensive, gear-driven cams really allow for faster revolutions while maintaining perfect timing at all temperatures. Now, Honda would continue to perfect this setup for even more revolutions per minute, but the CBR 250 was incredible for more than just its engine. This had a full sport bike fairing, and it utilized an innovative, fully aluminum diamond construction twin tube frame, but perhaps most important, it looked and really rode like a true sport bike. The uninitiated could easily mistake it for being the same kind of bike as, say, a GSX-R 750, or more importantly, Honda's incoming flagship sport bike, the Hurricane. Now, enthusiasts will tell you, if you're interested in getting your hands on one of these high-revving 250 JDMs, this isn't the one to get. Honda's CBR 250 would really reach its peak a few years later when they would up the ante, and that would be in the form of the Honda CBR 250RR, or the MC22, released in 1990, just a few years prior to this entire segment going completely out of style in Japan. Often the final iterations are the best, and that's certainly true here. Now, the MC22 was really extreme Japanese motorcycle engineering at its finest. By this point, all of the Japanese manufacturers had joined this odd little race to build the ultimate small supersport. Now, for whatever reason, making a large displacement motorcycle rev to 20,000 RPM, it just makes it quite fragile. This is why production sport bikes will never be at the level of MotoGP bikes. But in smaller packages like the CBR 250RR, it's possible to make a somewhat mass-produced small motorcycle that really is an engineering feat. I mean, a 17,000 RPM redline was absolutely insane in 1986. It still is today. But in 1990, Honda decided to shoot for the stars with a redline of 19,000 RPM. That's 1,500 higher than Suzuki's 250 and 500 more than Yamaha's. And for Honda, the tack went all the way to 21,000. Now, at this point in the battle of the revs, as we could call it, it was really Kawasaki who Honda was now competing with. Since its release in '88, the Baby Fireblade and the Baby Ninja, that is the ZX250RR, they were both redlining at 19,000 RPM. So for this new rendition in 1990, Honda went beyond just the tachometer to make their bike stand out. First, they brought down the weight about 20 pounds down from the outgoing MC19, giving the MC22 a dry weight of 313 pounds. This was mainly due to the new cast twin spar aluminum frame taken straight from their equally impressive CBR 400RR. It also featured Honda's state-of-the-art new direct air induction. This primarily affects balance and throttle response. Remember, these are still carbureted bikes. In the case of the Baby Fireblade, it had 4 20mm carburetors, just tiny. In this direct air intake or direct air induction, it brings in air to the airbox and to the carbs, and those carbs are actually tuned specifically to utilize some of this positive air pressure for balancing the air that's inside the float bowl and other things. Depending on your speed, specific vents would open and close in those intakes one at a time, and it's really just a perfect example of Honda engineering at its finest, just utilizing everything they can to dial in the performance of their machines. One of the biggest differences for the MC22 was its styling. First, they updated the body to be more aerodynamic and modern. They wanted it to follow the trends of bigger sport bikes and really look like those sport bikes that everybody wanted. And in 1992, when the CBR 900RR Fireblade was released, Honda went to their little 250 and they replaced the Hurricane decals for the Fireblade one. Again, the whole idea was for these bikes to point to the biggest, baddest sport bikes in their lineup, and the Fireblade was the epitome of performance in the 90s. So this was like a baby blade. Also, any decals that said 250 were somewhat minimized, and then that big Fireblade decal was just front and center, sort of shouting at you that this is a real sport bike. Now, this would really be the real peak for these tiny, high-revving inline-4 sport bikes. Honda was doing it best at this point, with Kawasaki right behind, but in 1994, most of the laws necessitating these motorcycles, most of them went away, especially the one making it illegal for inexperienced riders to own bikes with more than 250 cc's capacity. So just 2 years later, the Baby Blade would go away in Japan, though it would continue to be sold in Australia until 2000. Because of this, the easiest way to get your hands on one of these, if you're in the US or maybe in the UK, is to get one from Australia. They're readily available and they're super cheap, or if you're really excited about these, you could just move to Australia. That'd maybe be a dumb reason to move to Australia. Now, it is true that motorcycles like the Honda CBR 250RR, it's true that they came out of competition and a desire to reach young, budding sport bike riders, but when you look closely at these bikes, it all starts to get a bit confusing. Why make a small, seemingly beginner sport bike rev to 20,000 RPM? I mean, 45 horsepower is a lot for a 250, but it's still just 45 horsepower. And that power and minimal torque for that matter, none of it is accessible below 13,000 RPM. These are not around town bikes. They're not really very friendly. They just aren't at home and really all that enjoyable, and they're pretty gutless unless they're absolutely screaming. Because of this, these bikes really called for some level of experience. Riding a high-revving inline-4 sport bike in a way that actually taps into its capabilities means keeping it on the edge. And this is what, MotoGP riders are so great at. And that's what it takes to really get all the performance out of these bikes. And maybe that was the idea. Maybe the bike would teach riders this concept of staying up in the revs, but it's all just so extreme and so over the top. Beginner sport bikes today couldn't be further from these bikes in character. Most of them are singles, though some are twins. They make the same or a bit less power, but they don't rev, and they're more torquey and just more usable. Now, it could be that we just understand better at this point what beginners need, but that doesn't really seem to be true. Honda had been making small singles and twins for newer riders since the 60s. We've known that those are better for beginners. And for that reason, I think that these bikes actually served a greater purpose for the Japanese manufacturers. It seems as though these motorcycles were meant to kind of be test beds for what they could create. And I wonder if in producing bikes like the Baby Blade, companies like Honda weren't hoping to bring a production leader bike, for example, or maybe a 750 out that could rev to 18 to 20,000 RPM. And maybe this was the time where all of the manufacturers realized that this just isn't possible. Yes, MotoGP bikes rev that high, but it's just not possible for big production sport bikes to rev that high. MotoGP engines are amazing and powerful, but they're incredibly fragile at the same time. And it's not like you can put 100,000 miles on them. The 1990s would mark the end of the two-stroke era in Grand Prix racing. I think that many of the Japanese manufacturers at this point saw it coming, and that's why we see so much development on the production side for four-stroke sport bikes. I mean, you'd think that two-stroke sport bikes would be the name of the game on the production side as it was in racing, but that wasn't the case. Superbikes were taking over, and ultimately racing regulation would take the two-strokes out, and all the manufacturers would focus on four-stroke development. And exactly what the Japanese manufacturers did with their little 250s, that is pushing the limits to get more revs, they would do that again with their 1000cc race bikes just a few years later in MotoGP. Now, as we say in every video that I make on amazing motorcycles of the past, times have changed. Yes, Honda has a new CBR 250RR, but it redlines at 14,000 RPM. Kawasaki seems to really be the only Japanese manufacturer that's willing to make truly audacious motorcycles anymore, and their new ZX4RR revs to 16,000 RPM, and it costs twice as much as the Ninja 400. Now, 16,000 RPM is crazy by today's standards, but, the 90s, they would just all laugh at it. It makes me wonder why we're going backwards. Is it a fear that ridiculous motorcycles like the screaming 250s from the 80s and 90s, that maybe they'll have warranty problems? I don't know, a lot of these bikes prove to be incredibly reliable. Maybe it's just that the manufacturers think that riders aren't interested in ridiculous machines like these, and they could be right. Thanks for watching, and yeah, we'll see you guys in the next one. Ride safe.